Daesh's so-called caliphate may be physically gone, but its appeal to some appears to endure. Attacks are carried out in its name, and its leader is trying once again to inspire followers around the world. Is Daesh a global threat now? Welcome to Roundtable with me, David Foster. Welcome to the programme. From an attack on a military base in Central Africa to the Easter atrocities at churches in Sri Lanka, Daesh, or Islamic State, call it what you will, continues to export its brand of terror to countries far beyond its failed caliphate in Iraq and Syria.
Daesh may have lost territory in Syria and Iraq, but their radical ideology lives on. Last month, Sri Lanka witnessed the bloodiest terrorist attacks in its modern history. 8 blasts hit churches and hotels across Sri Lanka, killing more than 250 people on Easter Sunday. Daesh claimed responsibility for the terror attacks. The US State Department said in 2017 alone, Daesh and its affiliates carried out attacks in more than 20 countries outside its failed caliphate. In April, the group's leader appealed to followers around the world. Theirs would be a long battle against the Crusader, he said. But how far has the ideology of Daesh spread, and can it find a stronghold again?
Hello, I'm David Foster, and joining me from Jakarta we have Andhika Chris-nayudh-anto from Indonesia's National Agency for Combating Terrorism. At the Roundtable itself, Margaret Gilmore, a Security and Terrorism analyst and former Senior Research Fellow at RUSI. David Otto here too, Director of Counter-Terrorism and Organised Crime at Global Risk International. And Jahan Mahmood, former UK Home Office Counter-Terrorism Advisor. Great to have you all on the programme. David, you've just come back from Nigeria, from the north, from Maiduguri, the heartland of Boko Haram. Did you see Daesh, ISIS influence there?
I think that has been, really one of the evidence of the fact that Daesh, even though they've been defeated from the stronghold in Iraq and Syria, in Mosul and Raqqa, to be specific, they still have a very powerful influence, especially in Nigeria, where I've just been. They have the Islamic State of West African Province, which is being run by Abu Musab al-Banawi. They carry out serious attacks against military hard targets. They have a strategy of avoiding civilian casualties, because they believe that by attacking the military as of 2 or 3 days ago and cutting away with huge amounts of weapons, what they've done is to make the local population be fearful of Daesh and to actually make the military to constantly be on the defensive. So this is some of the remnants of what has happened with the collapse of the Islamic State.
Does that suggest to you, Margaret, that the influence of the group that we saw set up its so-called caliphate has actually spread worldwide? Or are they just sort of similarly extreme wherever they happen to be in terms of their ideology?
Ever since they were set up, we've seen them diversifying in all sorts of different ways to make them a much more complex organisation. So while we could focus on the military battlefield, the caliphate that built up in Syria and Iraq, since that territory has now gone, they still maintain a publicity department. There is still a leadership in hiding, probably still in Syria, and they still have access to quite a lot of money. And they still want to keep up their profile and morph into something different, just as they morphed out of Al-Qaeda. So we've seen over the years them setting up in places like Africa, and David knows all about all the countries in Africa where they have been operating. They've been setting up in Asia. We've known about the Philippines. We've certainly known about networks affiliated to them in Indonesia. We know that they've set up in some of the Caribbean countries, for example, and we've seen proof that they have sent fighters back to European countries. On top of that, we've had what we're really seeing in a big way now, which is urging supporters, people with similar ideology who may want to jump on the bandwagon and get more publicity than they would otherwise get, urging them to carry out so-called lone wolf attacks. But on top of that, I think what you're seeing is regional networks, let's call them that, in places like Sri Lanka, where it wasn't expected, who suddenly realized that they may have a local battle to fight, but share the same ideology, allowing ISIS to link into them and then using ISIS to get themselves the type of publicity they would never usually dream of, but can help them recruit.
Should we go to Indonesia? Andhika, your group is fighting terrorism in your particular country, Indonesia, and what was it, last 12 months ago or thereabouts, the Surabaya bombings. Right. Are you seeing the influence of one particular group, ideology, i.e. Daesh, ISIS, or are you seeing people with local grievances who attach themselves to ISIS because that gets them bigger headlines?
I think what we're seeing is that there is that influence from Daesh and ISIS to the local cells in Indonesia, where I believe what Margaret said is that there is that link, there is that regional link where many of the local cells in Indonesia are linked to ISIS or Daesh itself. So again, if you look at it, the influence of ISIS is not just excluded to Syria and Iraq, but it is also a sort of a global phenomenon, and that has an outreach towards Southeast Asia as well.
And do you think it is going to be more difficult to take it on individually in particular nations where people can hide themselves much more easily than if they're on the battlefield in plain sight in a country such as Syria?
Right, and it becomes more complicated because these are local cells, very small, containing 2 or 3 people, and then they feel that they have these grievances and they're linked up with a international terrorist group, and that is why I think that makes it more harder for us to, in a way, monitor or enforce the law. And I think this is a problem of that.
And one of the things I've read about that you believe you've been quite successful in is in trying to persuade people who may have grievances that this isn't the path down which to go.
Right, and these are the things that the government is trying to do. We set up a new revised law on anti-terrorism in June 2018, where the particular law emphasizes on preventive measures. It focuses on counter-radicalization, de-radicalization, as well as national preparedness. And all those are geared towards in efforts to prevent terrorism from happening by actually addressing the drivers of violent extremism.
Jahan, thank you very much, Andhika. We'll come back to you in a bit. Jahan, do you go along with the assumption we've heard at this table that the influence of Daesh, ISIS, is spreading, and we'll talk about Southeast Asia here, that it is moving away from its original Caliphate heartland?
Yeah, I think it's following a similar pattern to Al-Qaeda. We saw the decentralization of a head or a leadership, and ultimately it diversify and disperse into different areas and regions, and they're more or less following exactly the same pattern. If you actually deconstruct and dissect the video of Baghdadi, is that there are elements that are so close to some of the videos that were aired on Osama bin Laden, the AK-47 in the background, the kind of vest, the camouflage jacket and so forth. So you can see that they're following a similar pattern. The concern, obviously, for someone like me who's involved in domestic security is particularly the South Asian sector, which up until now has resisted the influence and the impact of the ISIS narrative and propaganda. And what we have seen over the last decade or so is British Arab communities, particularly British Libyans, take a natural interest in what's happening in Libya. British Syrians will naturally take an interest in what's happening in their own country. And the South Asian Muslim diaspora is probably Britain's largest Muslim population. And we've seen a movement of them into the Afghan sector during the war against America and using Pakistan as a transit. So my concern would be, and my hope, is that they don't have any further impact than what's already happened in Sri Lanka, because that could have direct implications on the community here, and they could exploit some of the vulnerabilities, and that, for me, is a worry.
I suppose then what that leads me to is to wonder how dangerous they are as a group outside their caliphate, perhaps more dangerous than being centralized.
Yeah, because they're soft targets. They're basically now looking for soft targets. They have lost their last bastion, which was Baghouz, and ultimately it's easier for them to exist as disparate groups across many countries. And it's often a symbiotic relationship now. You can have a small group who has a grievance, who's looking to be part of a bigger, more fearful group, and ISIS will always claim it because it allows them to exist.
Do they need central command in this, or are they actually sort of doing pretty well?
Well,
In quotes, pretty well.
Well, I think in terms of the command system, as Jahan said, DAESH doesn't really depend on the centralized command which Al Qaeda had in the days of Bin Laden. I think what they have realized is that the more cell-based commands they have in different provinces, in different countries, and different continents, the better it is for them to coordinate these attacks, or perhaps assist some of these cell-based morally, ideologically, to carry out some of their attacks. I also do believe that there is a certain change of pattern in the way that DAESH is operating as opposed to the way Al Qaeda used to operate. I mean, DAESH now focuses, if I look at examples in Africa, they focus a lot on attacking military hard targets, because they have realized that the only way to keep the population very close to DAESH, as opposed to depending on the military and the security services, is to attack the military and make them...
And not attack civilians.
Not attack civilians.
Yeah. Heard the list of countries that Margaret put out just now.
Yes.
Well, yeah, you want to say something first?
I just want to say, I think what you've just described there shows that ISIS is diverse. It doesn't really matter to ISIS as long as it gets the publicity it wants and keeps its global brand. That's what it wants. So I think, and this is why the whole threat is much more diverse, global, and complicated for those trying to fight it, because you have got this focus on the military, which is being dealt with at a fairly local, country-by-country level in Africa. But Sri Lanka shows that they're always going to go for the soft target. That's easy. And by going into Sri Lanka in the way they did, they can hit a whole range of other Western countries, for example, if they choose to, because many of the people killed were tourists. So they will continue to go for tourists. At the same time, there may well still be sleeper cells, which are controlled by the leadership somewhere and have a mastermind based somewhere in the very old-fashioned, cell structure that goes all the way back to IRA through Al Qaeda, very similar setup. And then you've got the urging, somebody in their back room in any country in the world.
But when the Caliphate, as it was called, existed, there was access to a great deal of money, wasn't there? Because the oil revenues in that area. How can you possibly run an international network? This is for any one of you or all of you. How can you run an international network without that kind of backing?
Well, they still have a little bit of money. Not all of the money has been accounted for. So certainly governments, the US, the UK, have a lot of people working on trying to break the finances, find out how much money, and we're talking, it could be tens of millions of pounds still here. But look at what happened in Sri Lanka, look at what's happening in Africa. Those attacks don't need Al Qaeda money, and yet Al Qaeda still has pots of money somewhere along the line. So I think finance is just one strand of trying to stop them, but there are a lot of other strands as well.
But also I think they have a local way of raising these funds rather than expecting that DAESH transfers some money to them. If, for example, when DAESH realized that it was losing some of its stronghold in Raqqa and Mosul, what it did was it created a faction in Afghanistan, sent some of the ISIS fighters into Tora Bora, where that was some kind of a triangle for drugs dealing, where they could access a lot of funding. They've done the same in the Lake Chad region with the Islamic State of West African Province. They've now created a new wilayat, which is a province in Congo. And the borders of Uganda, which the leader of DAESH, al-Baghdadi, mentioned. So what they are doing is they are placing their their cells not just in strategic areas where they can raise a lot of funds, but also in areas where they can recruit more people into their
Let's go back to Jakarta and ask Andhika, is there any way that you've learned that you think could be instructive to other countries about how best to take on the local cells, the franchises, whatever you want to call them?
Right. I think what we're looking into is how, after all this time, what the approach has been for Indonesia has been hard power. So that was the approach that we had when we were facing influences by Al Qaeda, where it was more centralized. But now with ISIS influencing our local networks in Indonesia, and that's where we saw the need that we need to move away from a hard approach towards a more soft approach, whereas we see most of our interventions are focused on preventing That is, for example, one of the things that the National Counterterrorism Agency is working on is how we can involve the youth in efforts to prevent terrorism from happening. And this is something that most governments need to do right now when we look into the effects of the influences of Daesh in the region in particular.
And also, I've read that you use something called the early intervention approach, the soft interview, etc.
Right. What we've also introduced is that one of the major outcomes from the new law, the revised law actually, is that the police or the law enforcement have the authority to apprehend those for preparing the terrorism acts. We've also criminalized, for example, incitement to terrorism, which is something that before we could not have done, but now we could do. And we also could not criminalize for those people joining, for example, as FTF to Syria and Iraq, and now we have that ability. So these are the preventive measures that are also built into law enforcement.
Which, of course, may only work in a country like Indonesia, or a different approach may only work in a country such as the Philippines or Chad or wherever we've mentioned. Is it possible to get any kind of collective movement against the new Daesh?
I think...
Okay, Andhika, we'll stick with you for that one, then come back to the studio.
Right. When I think what we can do is we can sort of replicate these measures or these best practices, if I may call it, and lessons learned that we learned from efforts in preventing terrorism. And one of them that Indonesia is spearheading is having a ASEAN regional action plan on countering radicalization and violent extremism.
But Jahan, is that something, is a common approach at all viable?
I think there can't be like one elixir that fits all the different kind of narratives that we're combating. So for instance, you have to take into account the local dynamics, the local grievances, the triggers and the drivers. Although on a kind of global level, yes, we can dissect ISIS, its ideology, its motivations. Even the fact, one of the things that we don't raise is that actually the largest victims of ISIS has actually been the Muslim community, the local communities where they reside. And I think if that could be pushed out harder across the board, across the spectrum, it would enable us to actually ensure that the more vulnerable elements of the Muslim community, who they're trying to target at the very forefront, from the outset, realize that this is not a group that we want to be involved in because it is anti-Islamic, its ideology, it's not Islamic, and its largest victims happen to be Muslims as well.
Yeah. I mean, more dangerous now, perhaps, than it was before in some ways, because its energies may well have been focused on what was happening across the Levant. And yet now that is not there, and they only have what we've been talking about today, the franchises.
I think the danger is a different type of danger, and because it's more diverse, it's much more difficult to find out where you should concentrate. So on a global level, for an intelligence agency, the ones, you know, there is a coalition of some 79 countries led by the US really having a go. And first of all, they've got to work on the internet and the way they communicate. And Al-Qaeda still managed to put out speeches by al-Baghdadi and what have you. They still have an online magazine, they still get their messages across. However many websites you bring down, they still manage to do that. So you've got to see how they are influencing people back home. So many millions of people across the world still on the internet. You've got to go for the finances. You've got to look at the way the people are crossing borders, because there are these ex-fighters. So there's so many different levels at which they are now a danger, and I think that's the problem. So you haven't got the huge masses of deaths and the actual physical war in the Middle East, but the danger remains in very different ways, and what we don't know now is which of all those different things will end up dominant.
And I think it's, as you rightly said, it's a multi-dimensional, multi-level approach, which I believe that the best way to approach that is the bottom to top, approach, which means you've got to go to the local level in terms of designing your national anti-terrorism and counter-terrorism strategy, because it is at the bottom level, it is at the local level that these groups germinate. This is where they plan the attacks, they prepare the attacks, they become vulnerable. So any national strategy, which of course will be linked to